Hey everybody, it's Chris from Steeda, and today is an awesome day. We not only have a rapid red GT500, we're going to be throwing GT500 Steeda Dual Rate Springs on this thing, as well as a set of camber plates to dial everything in. We're going to show you a product review, a step-by-step installation, and ultimately the owner, Rob, his reactions on how this thing drives. Stay tuned. Here we have our dual rate springs fitting the 2020 plus GT500 Mustang. We also have these springs available for pretty much any other S550 Mustang combination, both MagneRide specific and non-MagneRide, as well as our camber plates for S550 Mustangs. This is exciting because we finally have a rapid red GT500 to install these dual rate springs on, not only taking the looks to an entirely new level, but more specifically, the handling. These dual rate springs will lower your GT500 roughly a ½ inch from factory. Now that could differ a bit depending on if you have a base GT500 or a carbon fiber track pack from the factory, knowing that those carbon fiber track pack springs will lower the 500 a bit more. What sets these springs apart from many other springs out there is that they aren't linear, they aren't progressive, they're dual rate, meaning that you have a primary rate and a secondary rate. Most of the Ford OE springs are all linear, meaning you have one spring rate consistently all the way down as the spring compresses, versus progressive, much of the aftermarket, is a ramp of the rate as the spring compresses. The dual rates, it's one rate, and then when the spring reaches a certain point, it jumps to the second rate. This is much more predictable on track, helps to keep the car planted, and your GT500 will absolutely just cruise down the highway, but when you lean into it, you get in that secondary, very stiff rate. It's going to completely change the way your car behaves. These springs won't only benefit your car from a performance standpoint, but also from looks too. You will be roughly a ½ inch lower from factory, which is honestly the perfect drop on these cars considering they're already plenty low from the factory. These springs have also been tested heavily on our yellow number 20 race car that sees Daytona, Sebring, Palm Beach International Raceway, and many other tracks in the Southeast. Our HPDE car, my personal GT350, and of course, our EcoBoost handling build that sees all kinds of autocross time. They've been track proven and street proven as well. Completing the package with your dual rate springs, we highly recommend you add a set of S550 camber plates as well. One thing that these camber plates do have over the factory camber plates that come with those handling pack and carbon fiber track pack cars is that they have adjustability up to nearly 3 degrees without cutting your strut towers. And if you want even more adjustability, you can cut your strut towers, which we do have an S550 strut tower cutting tool to use, so you can get up to negative 3.4, 3.5, or even 3.6 degrees of negative camber up front. If you're looking for a great way to take not only the looks, but also the performance and handling capabilities of your 760 horsepower GT500, this is the way to go. So stay tuned for a full installation and ultimately what this thing will look like after it's done. First, get the car lifted on a car lift or a set of jack and jack stands, and then you can remove the front wheels. Unplug the main MagneRide connector, and then you can remove the caliper bolts. This customer has aftermarket caliper studs installed, so you want to use the correct Torx bit in order to remove the factory caliper. Once the 2 bolts are removed, you can pull the caliper off and lay it on the subframe, the rear leg of the K-member, and after that, pull the rotor off. Next, you'll move up to the end link on the strut. You'll want to grab an 18mm wrench and a socket to remove the end link out of the strut. You can see Jamie's having a little bit of trouble getting the end link out of the strut. All you need to do is grab a pry bar and either push up or pull down on the whole assembly in order to get the end link loose. Grab a panel removal tool and work your way all the way around the shock itself. You want to remove the ABS sensor line as well as all the MagneRide wiring. You can set that aside, and now you're ready to disconnect the knuckle from the shock itself. One thing to keep in mind is that these bolts are splines, so they will require some hammering to get them out of the knuckle. If your car is relatively new, which a lot of these GT500s are, this should be a relatively easy process. After that, you can lower the vehicle and work your way to the engine bay. You want to locate all 3 nuts that are holding the strut mount to the strut tower. You can loosen the first 2 quickly, that's totally fine, pop the nuts off, but the third one, you'll want to use your other hand to hold on to the entire assembly underneath as you loosen that last nut so you can catch the whole assembly. Now you're ready to swap your springs. For this part of the installation, we highly recommend a certified technician swap the springs for you because this is very dangerous if you don't do it correctly. As you can see, Jamie has compressed the spring to get the tension off the strut mount. At that point, you can loosen up the strut nut, to remove the strut mount and get the spring off of the assembly. Once the strut mount is removed, you can remove the factory spring and slide your Steeda Dual Rate into place. Make sure that the spring is properly orientated on the bottom. You can see where there's a stop in the rubber isolator on the bottom part of the shock. Begin to compress the spring to allow enough room in the shaft so you can put the strut mount back on top. But in this case, we are using S550 camber plates from Steeda. Once your spring is in place, go ahead and compress it to allow enough room to install your Steeda camber plate. When installing the Steeda camber plates, you'll need to reuse the factory spring seat that came with your OE strut mounts. Once you have the camber plate in place, you can go ahead and grab a nut and tighten down by hand. Get the assembly up into place. Once the studs poke through the strut tower, you can tighten everything down by hand and ultimately with your wrench. You can lift the car back up and we're ready to work underneath. The knuckle is going to go back into place on the strut. And take your strut bolts, put them back in. Remember, they go in from the front towards the back. Get the end link up into place, put the nut back on. Then you can grab your two nuts and put them back on the strut bolts. You can tap them in with a hammer to get the spline started and tighten down with an impact. Once you have that tightened, go ahead and tighten the end link. Put the ABS line and MagneRide wiring back into place and you can reconnect the MagneRide connector. Reinstall the rotor and you can grab a lug nut to hold the rotor in place while you reinstall the caliper. Make sure everything's tight and you can move on to the rear. Go ahead and pull the wheel off, and if you have Steeda IRS subframe braces installed, you can go ahead and remove those first. Next up, this is unique to the GT500. The exhaust is so large that you actually need to unbolt the sway bar in order to get enough clearance for the rear subframe to pull the spring out and put the new spring in. You can either pull the sway bar completely out or just let it hang. Next, you'll want to remove the two bolts holding the bottom of the shock to the lower control arm. After that, disconnect the MagneRide from the top of the shock mount and unbolt the shock mount. You'll also want to unbolt the bracket holding the brake line in place. Next, you'll want to remove the two bolts holding the bracket towards the front of the rear subframe. Then you're ready to unbolt the subframe. Once the first one's out, that's easy, but then the rear subframe bolt, slowly loosen that so the entire subframe falls, but keep in mind you do not want to do both sides at the same time. Make sure you work on one side of the subframe at a time so nothing falls out of spec. At this point, you're ready to remove the spring. You may need a buddy to get a pry bar to pull down the lower control arm to allow enough room to pull the spring out, but take your time, you'll be able to get it out. Fun fact, MagneRide cars have reverse wound springs in the rear of the car. This means that your left rear spring and your right rear spring are actually mirror images of each other. Make sure that you're putting the right spring into place in the rear. You can compare your factory spring against the Steeda Dual Rate. Now you're ready to put the Dual Rate spring into place. The tighter coils go towards the top. Grab the rubber isolator from your factory spring and make sure it's oriented in the correct location on the top of the spring. You'll know because the rubber isolator actually has a stopping point where the coil actually stops. You'll want to grab a jack to lift the subframe back into place. At this point, you're ready to take your subframe bolts and get them started by hand. This part is very important because these are very easy to cross thread, so make sure you start the subframe bolts by hand before tightening down. You can see this car already has our Steeda subframe bushing insert system already installed. When you're putting the bracket up front back into place, make sure you have everything in the correct order when you're putting the subframe bolt back in. Go ahead and tighten everything down. The subframe bolts are to be torqued to 129 foot-pounds. After that, move up, you can put the brake line bracket back into place. After that, go ahead and put the rear shock mount back into place. Tighten everything down. Make sure you plug your MagneRide sensor back in. Then you're ready to bolt the shock back to the lower control arm. You may need a transmission jack or a jack to get the shock back up into place. You can go ahead and get the bolts started by hand and then tighten them down. Work your way back and forth and tighten them down evenly. Then you can bolt your sway bar back into place. And if you have Steeda IRS subframe support braces, this is the time to reinstall them. Tighten everything down, and your installation is complete. We do recommend getting in alignment after installation. Go ahead, take your car out for a spin real quick. If everything looks good, feels good, at that point it's ready to get in alignment. All right, Rob, we're back again. I'm having some deja vu. Feel like we just did this.
Yep.
Dual Rate Springs.
Yep.
GT500.
Trying to take it up a notch.
So you had the base springs on this thing. And then after that, you went out and picked up the carbon fiber track pack springs, right?
Yep.
And now taking it up a notch and putting the dual rates on.
Yeah, I mean, so far, I mean, the carbon fiber track pack springs lowered the car a little bit. It was better than the bases, but especially with the car having wheels on it,
right,
this is the stance that it definitely needed, and, you know, upgraded performance, you know, together, can't beat it.
I mean, like we were talking about, looks are one thing,
yeah,
and that's important, don't get me wrong. When you lower a car, you want it to look good.
Yep.
But the performance, I mean, you bought this car to drive it, to race it, to do fun things with.
Yep. So if I can make it look better and track better at the same time, you know, can't beat it.
So to complete the package with the dual rate springs, we did add camber plates as well. And I know this was a handling pack to begin with, right?
Yep.
So it had the factory camber plates.
Yep, and the factory camber plates just barely got it past -2, so not really where we wanted to be. It had, when I went to the firm with the, you know, all stock basically, with the camber plates all the way maxed out, it still killed the outside, you know, the front left, you know, in the hairpin.
So she should be able to get on it a little bit. Got the roundabout coming up here.
Tire's a little cold.
Yep. So what mode are you in?
This is sport mode.
Okay. So a little bit of slip, but traction control is still
traction control is on. But yeah, I mean, I mean, it feels planted for sure.
So it'll be a little bit softer in the primary rate than what you're used to, whether it's the base 500 springs or the carbon fiber track pack springs. But the secondary rate is a lot stiffer in the rear, decently stiffer in the front.
It has pretty much zero roll right now.
That put down power a little bit better.
It definitely has less roll when you're pushing it. So it had some noticeable roll even with the carbon track pack springs. I mean, it could go a lot faster, but
save your tires for track day.
Yeah.
Nice. I'm pumped for you, man. This thing
feels ready to...
looks the part, and from the carbon fiber track pack springs, which is the equivalent to a track pack 500, you're looking at about a 1/2-inch drop square, which is awesome. And then from a base 500, I mean, probably 3/4 of an inch.
Yeah, it's got to be quite a bit, because the carbon fiber track pack springs got it into the realm of, in my opinion, looking good, and then now it's like, this is exactly where it needs to be. The car doesn't look like it's slammed. It looks like it's, setup, you know, exactly, you know, if you had coilovers, like right where I would want to put it. So
perfect.
You know, it's got enough gap where it's not going to be scraping or rubbing, but it's like, you know, looks like a, you know, race car stance. Yeah, I can already tell it's going to drive good. I had them in my, you know, I had these on my GT, and I was really happy with the, you know, dailyable, you know, feel, and then car was really flat and really easy to drive on the track before, so looking forward to that.
Oh, I'm excited for you. I'm excited to see it. So comment below. Let us know what you want to see from Rob, because we enjoy having him here. We enjoy getting these dual rates on the GT500. If you want to pick up this kit for your 500, hit us up at Steeda.com. Perfect package, camber plates, the dual rates, sway bars too, maybe some sway bars in the future.
Yeah, let's do it.
Rob, tell them where to follow you on social media.
Yeah, so if you want to follow me on Instagram, it's Gringo Tuned. You can see the GT500 and front-wheel drive, all-wheel drive drag race Hondas as well. So a little bit of everything.
Awesome. Well, if you want to pick up these dual rates for yourself, go ahead and hit us up at Steeda.com. Camber plates as well. All GT500 mods right here at Steeda. Hit that like and subscribe button, the notification bell, and don't forget the most important thing.
Speed matters.